So this is our last big show for the Urban America unit entitled The Rise of Segregation. We're going to begin our story with the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. That's the fought between northern states loyal to the Union and southern states that had seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. The Civil War started for a variety of long-standing tensions and disagreements about American life and politics. For nearly a century, the people and politicians of the northern and southern states had been fighting over the issues that finally led to war, including economic interests, cultural values, the power of the federal government to control the states, and most importantly, slavery in American society. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, in which the South lost, the 13th Amendment was passed, which abolished slavery, which ended slavery in the United States. Reconstruction is that process of rebuilding the South after the Civil War. And the federal government ended Confederate secession and guaranteed rights to former slaves. After Reconstruction, that means after the federal government left the southern states, and they left them in 1877. They no longer had a military presence in southern states, states like Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and Florida and Texas and South Carolina and North Carolina. After they left, many African Americans in the rural South lived in poverty and suffered significant persecution from whites. White people punishing and going after the former slaves to keep them at a lower status. The first group we're going to mention are the Exodusters. That's about 6,000 African Americans left the rural South and headed to Kansas and formed and became farmers in Kansas. One thing that all southern states did was imposing segregation in the South. Segregation is the setting apart and separation of African Americans in the South by force of law. And so there would be separate drinking fountains for African Americans, as pictured here. There'd be separate schools and separate restaurants and separate hotels and separate everything, separate parts of town in which you could live. And these laws became known as Jim Crow laws. Those are laws that enacted to enforce segregation. Another thing was done was to implement poll taxes. These laws could be passed in part because most African Americans could be denied the right to vote through poll taxes, a fee that had to be paid to vote more than most African Americans could afford. So if you can change laws by voting for people who believe like you do, but if you can't vote, you're going to have a difficult time being able to change laws, especially if the people who were elected are against you. And then in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of segregation. It says that segregation as segregated public facilities was legal, and they used the term separate but equal. But in reality, the facilities were not equal. Because what does it mean to have an equal school, for example? Does it mean it has to look exactly the same? Does it have to be kind of the same? What about the quality of teachers? How do you measure the quality of teachers? So this became a way to have legalized segregation, keeping African Americans at a lower status. And the Supreme Court said that was okay, and all they had to do was, if they had white schools, they had to have some kind of building, some kind of facility for African American schools, but they weren't in any way, shape, manner, or form equal. And on top of that, there was significant mob violence. Now, I only give you data for about a 10-year period of time, but we're talking about mob violence that went really from 1870s until the 1960s. And I give you some data here between the 1890s. There were an average of 154 lynchings of African Americans in the South. That means executed by hanging by a mob with no trial. This is done illegally. A person would be taken out and murdered. And there was on average 154 per year in the South. And these people were never tried, and the people who murdered them were never brought to justice. This is just a brief introduction into the rise of segregation that was taking place while all of these other urban American things were taking place. But those urban American things were in the northern states, and this is a focus on the southern states. And that's your big show for today.